Thank you. It's very nice to continue after Skip. You ended up with the idea that the difficult part is escaping the old ideas, and I think that's largely the work we've been doing. I'm going to talk about a lifestyle intervention we've been running for 3 years, looking at the issue of energy, so relating to what Skip was talking about, but looking at the issue on the level of consumers and the communities that they belong to. Large part of the work we do is inspired by work done in public health, and that's where I want to start before going into the details of the work we've been doing. I don't know how much you know about Finland. I assume not that much. It's a country in Europe, between Sweden and Russia. I was born in Finland, like my colleagues, in the end of the 1970s, so I'm beyond the 30-year mark. During the time when I was born in Finland, it was a country that had maybe one of the unhealthiest lifestyles on the planet. I mean, people were smoking heavily, drinking aggressively, and behaving aggressively due to the drinking. And if you look at the diet, it was very heavy on sodium and fat. People did not really exercise apart from physical labor, and as a result of this, especially in the poorer parts of Finland, especially a part called North Karelia that's on the Russian border, basically every family had seen a family member, mostly men, dying out of coronary heart disease. Finland was like ranking on the top of the world in terms of coronary heart diseases due to lifestyles people were living. And bakeries, butcheries, shoemakers developing new products. This all happened simultaneously with rising wealth of the country, reform in basic education, Finland opening up to Europe, and health awareness. So it wasn't only due to the intervention, but the intervention really speeded up the processes that were happening in the country. And the reason why I'm talking about this is that it proves that lifestyles can be changed very fast and very radically, but only through these kind of lifestyle interventions that were very participatory. The government was then able to push through tougher regulation, change the dietary restrictions in schools and cafeterias, and people did not only accept them, but they supported them. It also proves that there's no silver bullet towards changing people's lifestyles, that you need to work on various fields at the same time and use the values when they are on your side and try to change the values when they're not. The North Karelia project was one of the inspirations when we started our work around energy 3-4 years ago, when the Finnish Innovation Fund, called Sitra, it works under the Finnish Parliament, asked us to develop new ways to reduce consumers' energy consumption. The epidemic we had at hand was slightly different, but not less dramatic. Let's put it, I try to get this working. Yes. Finland is a very educated country, but at the same time, it's one of the most energy-intensive national economies in the world. As the country has gotten, part of it is due to the industry in the country, but it's largely also due to the change of lifestyle that I described earlier. As the country has gotten richer and people have been able to travel, the consumption of meat has gone up dramatically in the country. The 1 million summer homes in a country of 5 million people are renovated into all-year use, so people basically have 2 homes they're heating up. Homes are bigger, people travel more, and when in the 1970s people ate canned vegetables for the whole winter, now greenhouse produced vegetables can be bought from every single market all through the year. And if you look at the climate impact, for instance, caused by housing in Finland, it's way above the European average. It's nearly double the European average. And on World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet Index, Finland ranks at 12, like most of the Nordic countries. This shows the nature of the challenge we had at hand. But simultaneously, the interesting part was that if you look at the value aspect, it seems everything is right. Everything is done, in a way. Finnish people being educated and well-traveled are also one of the most climate-aware people on the planet. 90% of the people accept climate change as a fact. I know that's slightly different than in the US. 85% see it as a risk to their well-being, and 80% are willing to take action. But if you look at the actions people take, their energy consumption is going up, and it's going up dramatically. So what we did is that we compared a vast number of awareness campaigns around the environment and looked at research on them, and we concluded that the effectiveness of most environmental awareness campaigns in changing people's behavior is actually very weak or even non-existing. As researcher Eva Heiskanen from the Finnish Consumer Research Center has pointed out in her research around this subject, she says that the current strategies in environmental awareness campaigns are victims of a highly individualistic view on people. That in most of these campaigns, people are observed as rational individuals who make their choices by themselves without the interference of others. The individualistic approach neglects also the power of model learning, and it underestimates the power of routines and convenience and infrastructure. And it's kind of paradoxical. At the same time, it overestimates the power of individual action, and it underestimates the power of collective action, especially on the emotional side of dealing with helplessness and anxiety that people experience around climate change. As Heiskanen has pointed out in her research, environmental awareness is a prerequisite for people to consider the environment in the choices they make. So it's not without value, but awareness or even motivation without having the right tools and the skills actually leads to more anxiety and more anger. As seen in public health, engagement is needed because it actually changes people's mindsets. The values are changed by the behavior, and it helps us deal with the change. This was the reason why in the proposal we made in the project called Peloton, to our founder Sitra, we moved consciously towards more participatory approaches in order to change the choice environment consumers work in. To identify the issues that we decided to work on, we developed this thing called decision tree. We looked at 6 fields of life, which you can see here: housing, food, transport, consumer goods, workplace, and free time. In the next phase, we then took these 6 issues and broke them into the decisions people take under these issues. We intentionally tried to look at these issues from the point of view of the individual or of an individual family, and talk about these things in a language that's understandable to both consumers and to corporations. What we did next is that we cross-tabled the decisions, looking at the frequency of those decisions and looking at the environmental impact of those decisions. This was done based on a very outstanding research by the Finnish Environment Center, which is a government research agency, where they've mapped all the material flows within the Finnish economy and also the consumer-based emissions. So people usually point out to the religion and sexual orientation, but I'll get to their importance in a minute. Based on this, we identified 4 types of decisions, and I think that shows where we've gone with our work. We identified things we called secondary decisions, small wrong decisions, frequent wrong decisions, and big wrong decisions. If we look at these more carefully, secondary decisions are issues that might be important for us as people, but actually, from an environmental point of view, they play very little role. If we look at small wrong decisions, such as choosing a plastic bag or a paper bag, these have been very much in the focus of a lot of the environmental awareness campaigns, but actually their environmental impact is very small. With frequent wrong decisions, we mean decisions such as shopping, choosing a holiday destination, where our conclusion was that the choice environment consumers work in, where they like what's available in the store, or what are the means we have in choosing our summer holiday, that needs to be diversified, i.e. we need new, better, sustainable products in that market. And finally, the big wrong decisions refer to decisions we take seldom, but which have significant impact on our environmental impact for maybe 15 or 20 years or 30 years even. Based on this analysis, we decided then to work on mostly on the big wrong decisions and also the frequent wrong decisions. As I explained earlier, going from this, we concluded that more attention needs to be put on enabling people to take control over their own lives and participation. This is why we moved to address the issue of gatekeepers. With gatekeepers, we refer to organizations, communities, individuals, professionals who are present in those situations when people make these choices. We addressed it in this sense. So we looked at the big decisions, the big wrong decisions from the previous map, and looked at who is present in that situation when people make that choice. Which professionals are present when people choose, for instance, a house or renovation of a house or even buy a car. By doing this, they basically either deny or enable people to have access to different choices or more meaningful action. As you might notice, the groups that are on this map are not the typical gatekeepers that most communication studies refers to. Most of the studies refer to things such as politicians and mainstream media. We also noticed when we approached these people and these professional groups for 2-day workshops around these issues, many of them had not realized that they have this role. So a key part of the work we did was making them aware that they play a gatekeeper role in energy issues. And that's where the name of the project Peloton comes from. Peloton, I don't know if any of you follow cycling or are enthusiast cyclists. Peloton is the name of the main group in a cycling competition where people cycle very close to each other to save energy, up to 40% of energy. It's also a very risky and fast-moving group, and that's also the group where you gather strength to start the takeoff. And that was kind of the analogy we used when we, the metaphor we used to approach these organizations, that there's a competitive logic around this. The key for our work was first to grow this main group, so make more people and more professional groups realize that they have a role in the energy issues, and then grow their hunger towards a takeoff. Here you see some of the groups that we worked with within the last 3 years. The structure of the workshops with all of these groups was similar. We first asked them to do a carbon footprint test. We interviewed them before they came to the workshop. And based on this, we presented them to each other. And this was important because we were able to demonstrate, for instance, with a carbon footprint test, that if you take women's magazine journalists, these people presume that they are living similar lives. They do the same jobs. But actually someone's carbon footprint can be 3 times bigger, and still they don't really see it in their day-to-day practices. It's important to realize that it was important for them to realize through that it is possible to make choices that have significant impact on your environmental burden. After that, we trained them on how their working environment is going to change during the next maybe 40 years. And then, together with all the competitors in the same room, we started working on solutions. We thought that it's important to have all the hardware stores or all the women's magazines in the same group, so they realize that all their competitors have the same information, all their competitors have the same ideas, and actually it's more about who gets there first. Also, we noticed that it was crucial that the companies paid for the participation. When they knew that all their competitors will be in the workshop, and they had invested in the training, the employers wanted to see some results, and they wanted to see those results pretty fast. So we've been doing this for 3 years with all of these groups, and we're able to demonstrate, I would say, significant results with some of these groups. One of the key goals was growing the group of people who see themselves as energy gatekeepers. One of the tools for this was that we organized 2 startup camps where we selected 15 ideas for new energy-smart products and services, and then we collected 150 professionals from design, business development, technology to form teams around these ideas. And it was really remarkable that people, high-level professionals, were willing to spend 2 days without pay boosting someone's idea because it has a good environmental impact. And I think that's a resource that should be used more. One of the biggest successes from this work is the work that we did with the leading hardware store. They launched an Energy Master service, that's the guy in the middle, where the shop offers everything from a home audit and equipment to installation to the consumer. And in that way helps people making smarter choices for their home. Due to the Peloton project and the participation in it, they understood that 50% of the buildings of 2050 are already built. Most of them need to be renovated during the next years to reach the targets of reducing the CO2 emissions from built environment by 90%. And they maybe should be the company that in a way gets into that market before their competitors. So they've started massive training for their staff, that their staff is able to offer this full service to people who are thinking of renovating their homes. Other examples on the right include a new domestic travel service that packages local luxury into full, let's say, weekend holidays. On another field, a leading women's magazine moved from the standard procedure of doing one green issue per year to actually looking at these issues through the year and realizing that their readers, who are mostly educated women in their 20s and 30s, want to make good choices, and they do their journalistic work better if they provide them for their readers. And it's actually the fastest growing women's magazine in Finland. Within the public sector, the home economics teachers, we have a subject like that in school, develop new teaching material for schools around tasty and seasonal food. So not around sustainable and environmental food, but tasty and seasonal food. In the Peloton project, we have looked into the motivations, abilities, and triggers for consumers to make different choices for themselves, but I want to talk a bit about what motivated these companies to join. When we approached these companies, we realized that most of them realized that questions of energy and questions of climate change will change their business environment. They had also noticed that there's a change happening in consumers' values and attitudes. But only a few companies have actually realized how this could be turned into a business case. Most of them had tried the two strategies on the lower part. So they have tried to make the current products that they're serving as efficient as possible. They had joined different efficiency protocols, but they understood that this is not generating more business. This also leads easily in the companies to a situation where the sustainability people are just making other people's work harder. They're not generating any new ideas, they're just demanding other people to do their work in a more rigid manner. The second strategy a lot of these companies had tried is that they offer ecological versions of their normal products. But they've also noticed that it's a very small group of consumers who are willing to pay the premium for those products. Also, often when companies launch ecological product lines, their estimation on the consumer market, or consumer segment, is so small that they don't put real R&D money into it, which leads often to a situation that the products don't work that well and they taste bad. When engaging with these companies and peer groups, the focus on lifestyles has been extremely useful. It has shifted the focus of debate from accurately trying to quantify every single environmental decision to actually understanding what's meaningful and what's not very relevant. It's also helped them understand that pro-environmental behaviors and choices can be pushed through other values than altruistic, pragmatic, pro-environmental values. That we can utilize issues such as faith, such as hedonism, the sense of community, technical mastery to push those solutions forward. The second transformative power for these companies has been work that it motivates their staff. That the Peloton strategy has actually helped. A lot of people have said that they feel more proud of the work they do. They don't need to, for the women's magazine journalist doesn't need to apologize for working for a women's magazine and they can still do good business for their employer. They can do their work well. And we've noted, through understanding this, we've started stressing more the importance of personal or even ethical engagement in the work. When people are engaged in kind of development projects in their work, they do their work better. When people don't have a contradiction between their personal values and their professional values, they do their work better. This might easily sound like kind of marketing and business development, but we see the work we do as politics, because the goal behind all of this work and the work with these companies has a political goal. As explained in the case of the North Karelia project, engagement of a larger part of people in the energy questions helps government push through different kinds of subsidies and new kinds of regulation. On the kind of the personal aspect, new services and products help people take more ownership over their lives. They feel like they're running their own lives and they can act better as parents or managers. They can, when they've tried something new, something that lasts also in a low carbon future, they can assure their kids that their kids are going to be fine. It also makes the debate more about what would be exciting and new rather than fighting over a constantly shrinking pie. I feel that if we want people to be open for changes, we need to find ways to help them deal with emotional aspects of climate change, such as fear, such as loss of safety, and shame. And I think the gatekeeper groups that I listed, there's tons of them more, are key to making that change happen. Thank you.
So I'm interested in the injustice of climate change, or climate change as a justice issue. And justice and morals are very much related, but I hope to kind of explain why I'm using justice specifically. So is climate change a justice issue? Oftentimes, even climate change researchers, people who are interested in reducing our emissions and things like that, don't necessarily think of climate change as a justice issue. But climate change is causing a number of harms. So lack of clean water resources, Ezra mentioned a lot of these different things. Decreased access to, or the ability to, decreased ability to produce food, increased diseases and illnesses, destruction of homes due to natural disasters which are related to climate change, things like floods, mudslides, landslides, wildfires. Forced migration, so people who are forced to move from their homes in order to find farming work and things like that. So is climate change a justice issue? Well, we probably don't think that we deserve any of those harms. So when do we accept or reject that those harms are happening to others? And so first of all, we need to know about the harm. That might be an obvious statement, but sometimes we forget about the fact that people might not be aware of the things that are going on. So we need to know that harms are occurring, like the list I put up here. And then we need to care that it is a problem. So we need to be concerned. We need to think that what's happening is an injustice happening to those people. And I will just point out quickly that Beth had mentioned I'm also doing my PhD in psychology, but also women's studies, and have done some work really looking into the gendered issue of the injustice of climate change. And if you aren't aware, women are largely disproportionately affected by climate change. They're less likely to have the resources, either economic, material, educational, in order to adapt to climate changes. They also have less of a voice in mitigating climate change policies and things like that. So if you are interested in that at all, please send me an email. I'm happy to share lots of information with you. So I'm interested in looking at scope of justice as a way to think about how do we see climate change as a justice issue, and how do we come to be concerned about that. So scope of justice is a theory proposed by Susan Apatow in 1987. And it's essentially talking about people who we see as either within or outside the boundary of which moral values, rules, and considerations of fairness apply. So either you think that these moral boundaries, these rules apply to people, or you don't. They're essentially a group of people who you think deserve the same rights, freedoms, and privileges that you yourself have. And if you think about what rights and freedoms and privileges are, they can be very broad. So the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They can be things as simple as owning a Mercedes, right? That's a privilege. So they can vary widely. We know from some of Susan Apatow's work that people who are within our scope of justice, we're typically willing to make sacrifices to help them. So I think that this is an interesting theory in terms of thinking about when we're concerned and whether we're willing to do something, go out of our way, sacrifice. Often, if you think about making pro-environmental changes in your life, that includes reducing some comforts and things that you might otherwise enjoy. Willing to make sacrifices to help others when we see that they're in need. And as I kind of mentioned, this can be context specific. So we might believe that all people deserve the right to have clean water and food and a nice house. We might think that people only deserve that if they contribute economically enough to the system and work hard enough. We might think that all people deserve the right to marriage, and we might think that that depends on the gender of the people involved in that. So it can be very context specific. It can depend on the type of justice or the type of privilege that's being given. And I do want to throw out there, what about animals in the environment? So probably as I'm talking about this, you're thinking about other human beings. But we can also extend a certain scope of justice to animals in the environment. We might have different beliefs about what type of justice animals deserve. We might think that they deserve to not live in pain or not live in fear. We might think that they deserve to not be killed. And even in the environment, even though it's not a living, or it is a living, not a feeling entity, there are certain rights and privileges that we might think that the environment deserves. The right to thrive and exist on its own and reproduce and that kind of thing. So I'm going to kind of share with you two studies I've done relating to scope of justice and thinking about how to expand our scope of justice, when we expand our scope of justice, and some of the psychological mechanisms involved in that. So the first study I'm going to talk about an emotional connection, so whether we empathize and care about those we see harmed, and having a heightened sense of emotion in general. And then empathic perspective taking, so taking the perspective of the person or animal being harmed, really sort of feeling what they feel, being in their shoes, as opposed to being more objective when you're viewing a situation about harm. And then study two, I'm going to talk about Self-transcendent values. So Ezra was just talking about values a little bit, and talk about the distinction there. Self-transcendent values are basically the amount that you sort of extend concern to others. So Schwartz talks about both benevolence and universalism. Benevolence tends to be more about being concerned about people around you, those you know, those you're close to, your family, your friends. Whereas universalism is extended to all human beings, animals, and the environment. Having a psychological connection. So Schultz's environmental concern scale talks about if there are environmental problems, who are you concerned about them impacting? And that includes the self, other people, and then the biosphere. And then in-group identification, so identifying as an environmentalist, being psychologically connected to that environmental group. And then we're proposing the idea of sensitivity as opposed to neutralization. So neutralization theory was originally proposed by Sykes and Matza in 1957. They started out with, I think, 5 neutralizations. And neutralizations are essentially psychological justifications for why we do things. So they started out with original 5 things like, it's not my fault, they deserved what they got. They've been expanded over the years by a number of researchers. So neutralization is something that people might use to sort of psychologically distance themselves from a harm that they're seeing. And we propose the idea of sensitivity for those who are more self-transcendent, who have a more expanded scope of justice, might be more sensitive to the harms that they're seeing, might be more likely to say, this is my fault. So the first study focused on harm toward animals specifically. And the kind of hypotheses that we're proposing is that whether you take an empathic or an objective perspective or no perspective will lead to specific emotions. So specifically, we think that it would increase worry, empathy, guilt, and shame. And then we also measured how angry people were either at those who denied climate change or those people who were contributing to climate change. So we thought that it would increase those emotions, as well as decrease emotions such as hope, pride, anger at accusers, and boredom, so apathetic emotions. And then emotions should then mediate the relationship onto willingness to take some sort of action, willingness to sacrifice or do something on the part of those being harmed. So and then environmental identity, we thought would moderate this sort of relationship. So people who are more identified as an environmentalist should be more likely to feel those emotions that I put up, either increase or decrease those specific emotions. So we had 519 randomly selected adults in the US. We used Amazon's Mechanical Turk to collect this data. We asked people to either take an empathic perspective, an objective perspective, or we didn't give them any instructions about what kind of perspective to take. And we were interested in whether taking an objective perspective would be any different, or whether people without any kind of thing are more likely, any kind of instructions are more likely to take an empathic perspective. Then we measured emotions and willingness to take action and self-identification as an environmentalist. So what the participants saw were these empathic or objective instructions. I won't read them all to you, but essentially the empathic is while you're viewing this image, try to feel what the animal feels, try to think of the impact that they're going through. Whereas the objective condition instructed people to try to not get caught up in how you're feeling, to kind of remain detached, focused on the objective sort of the words and the quality of the image and that kind of a thing. Here's the 2 different animals. They saw both of these animals in either condition. So we had a picture of a koala bear and a polar bear suffering from different elements of climate change. You can kind of read, there were little captions about kind of the harm associated with that. I love this picture of the koala bear here drinking the water. And then they reported all of the emotions I mentioned. They responded if they saw themselves as an environmentalist, and there were 3 options, so yes, somewhat yes, or no. And then we asked them, are you interested in learning more about this issue? And are you willing to donate an extra $1? So in Mechanical Turk, if you've ever used it, you pay people to take your survey. I think we paid participants about 50 cents to take this survey. And at the end we said, we'll give you an extra $1, a whole 100 cents more, and you can choose what you want to do with it. So we gave them the option of donating it to 3 different environmental organizations, so specifically the World Wildlife Fund, Union of Concerned Scientists, or Friends of the Earth. And they got a little blurb about kind of the mission statement of each group and how that group specifically is helping animals impacted by climate change. And they got to choose if they wanted to donate those 100 cents to the 3 organizations, to keep it for themselves, or to give it to no one. And they could do it in any kind of monetary amount that they wanted, as long as it added up to 100 cents. So they could give it all to themselves, they could give part of it to themselves, part of it to the organizations. So what we see, and my animations aren't working, is essentially, first of all, the 4 emotions that really tended to be important, that our different conditions predicted, were, can I play with this thing?
That's the other long.
Oh, I turned it off.
It's the other, yeah, it's the longer one on the, up there, so you can point out which
This one?
the longer with their pencil.
Oh, yeah. So anxiety, empathy, guilt and shame, and anger at people who deny that climate change is happening. And I should say that guilt and shame, in almost all of the studies we do, tend to load together, at least in terms of participants' perception of what those 2 things are. They don't tend to differentiate between the 2. So essentially what we're seeing, if I could have this nice graph one at a time here, the yellow bars is the harm-only condition, so that's where they were not instructed to take some sort of perspective. We see that overall people tend to feel more anxiety and empathy, less guilt and shame. We see that the pink condition here is the harms plus being told to take an objective perspective. And we see that overall, essentially, they're kind of the same. So it didn't matter if you were told to take an objective perspective or not take anything at all. People tended to feel about the same amount of emotion. But what we really found that was the most interesting was those who were told to take an empathic perspective. And you see in each one of these conditions here, those who took an empathic perspective were more likely to feel each of these emotions. So in all conditions, this empathic perspective condition was significantly higher for all these emotions. Flip slides here. So we see that perspective taking leads to these specific emotions. We found that environmental identity actually did not moderate any of this, so it didn't matter if people identified as an environmentalist or not. They still tended to feel these emotions. The only caveat to that was non-environmentalists were more bored in the objective condition than environmentalists. So the second part of the theory that I was talking about was the mediation. So we looked at whether perspective taking, which led to these emotions, if these emotions would then lead to willingness to take action. And what we find is that perspective taking alone is a significant predictor of willingness to take action. So the more those who took an empathic perspective were at the end more likely to donate more money. And we found that these 3 specific emotions did mediate that effect as well. So the more anxious you felt, the more empathy, and the more guilt and shame, the more likely people were to take action and donate money. And also we found that environmental identity was just, again, a direct predictor. So people who identified as environmentalists were more likely to donate money than people who did not identify as environmentalists. And I do want to point out that this is somewhat contrary to a lot of the research that is coming out about emotions and environmental psychology. That most researchers are saying we should be framing things in terms of positive emotions, hope, pride in what we're doing. And we're finding consistently in our research, at least, that guilt and shame and empathy in particular, empathy is a positive one, but guilt and shame tend to really be a strong predictor of people willing to do action. I have a couple of ideas about why the discrepancy is there. We can talk about that later. So just to kind of visually represent what I was just saying, in the harm condition on the left there, we see that people are donating more money to themselves than they are to the environmental groups. Same thing in the harm condition with taking an objective perspective. But the interesting phenomenon happens in the harm taking an empathetic perspective. We see that more people are donating money to environmental groups than they are giving it to themselves. So it's a nice swap there. Okay, so study 2. I know I'm kind of getting close on time. Our second study, we were looking at harm toward people and nature. And we were actually wondering if learning about the harm can increase scope of justice via increased psychological connection. So as I mentioned, Schwartz's environmental concerns, biospheric, altruistic, and egoistic, and increase their willingness to help. And in this study, instead of donations, what we looked at was people's willingness to support pro-environmental policies. And these were policies specific to our participants. So we did this study on Penn State's campus. We asked them specific questions about how would you feel if Penn State were to implement a green fee and that kind of thing. And then what are some of the psychological mechanisms that help to explain whether people have an expanded scope of justice versus a more narrow scope of justice? Again, so thinking about self-transcendent values is one way to sort of think about how wide your scope of justice is. In this study, instead of asking people or telling people to take a specific perspective, we let them choose the perspective they wanted to take. So we had them report afterwards what kind of perspective they were taking. And then whether they were more likely to be sensitive to the harms they were seeing, or they were more likely to neutralize that information. So what's happening over there has nothing to do with me, it's not my fault kind of statements. So visually, kind of to show what I'm talking about, we thought that these self-transcendent values would lead to sensitivity or neutralizations and also perspective taking, which should both then lead to environmental concerns. I'm not sure why that's not written correctly. And then the more concerned you are about the harms to the environment are having on you, other people, or the biosphere, the more willing you are to take action. And then just specifically, if people are high in self-transcendent values, they should be sensitive and empathic, which would lead to more environmental concerns and more willingness to take action. While if they have more self-enhancement values, which tends to be kind of the opposite of self-transcendence, so things like putting yourself forward, I think it's important to make money and have high status, the more likely we thought they would be to neutralize or to take an objective perspective when they're viewing harms, which should lead to less environmental concern and less willingness to take action. So we had 156 college students on our campus. They watched 3 clips from the film Manufactured Landscapes. I know Beth has done some studies on manufactured landscapes. That's kind of how we got into, and I've used this film now for several different studies. If you haven't seen it, you can access the entire thing on YouTube. It's essentially a compilation of images that mass consumerism, the impact that mass consumerism is having on nature and people. So here are some of the images that they see in the film. The impact on nature. I think the River of Flames is a very poignant one. And then the impact on people. So we see the impact of people having to work in mass production factories, living among the waste from mass consumerism. Down here is a woman sorting through e-waste in China. And actually what we found is that when we looked at the values, they really kind of came out into 3 specific groups of values. So we had self-transcendence toward the environment, self-transcendence toward people, and then self-enhancement that I was talking about. We found that these were each good predictors of different things. So we found that the more self-transcendent people were toward the environment, the more likely they were to be sensitive to the harms that they were seeing in these videos. The more self-transcendent people were to other people, the more likely they were to take an empathic perspective when watching the video. And then we found that the more self-enhancing values people held, the more likely they were to neutralize in the video. And we gave them the option to sort of agree with statements like, what's happening over there is not my fault. We also found that self-transcendent values led directly to concerns about the biosphere and about other people. And we found that it directly led to willingness to take action, so more likely to support the policies that were pro-environmental policies.